Convocation did not come to conquer Earth. 511 member species voted unanimously to save it. That was the problem. A unanimous vote of 511 species, none of whom had asked a single human a single question, is not a rescue. It is a verdict. The verdict arrived as a formatted document, translated into English by a courtesy protocol that had clearly never needed to translate an insult before. Sol 3 Stellar Instability Advisory Category. Terminal Compassionate Relocation Authorized. Beneath the header, a diagram of Earth-Sun with a red band around the corona dated 12 years out. Beneath that, a single line that every network on the planet would replay for a week. Full evacuation is not a request. It is a mercy your species is not yet equipped to refuse wisely. Every human government that received the advisory checked the signature first. Because the Convocation had never once been wrong about a stellar classification in 5 centuries of recorded relocations. And being wrong about a star was, among the 511 member species, considered close to a physical impossibility. That reputation was the real weapon. It was not the 6 vessels that would arrive later. It was the certainty that no one, human or otherwise, would think to check the math of a civilization that had never needed checking before. Adjudicator Velsorin delivered the ruling in person, in perfect, unhurried English, standing in the UN General Assembly with the calm of someone reading a weather report. He smiled the way people smile at children who have drawn something with the wrong number of legs. "We understand this is difficult to hear," he said. "In another few decades, your descendants will understand it as the kindness it is." Behind him, the projected model of Earth-Sun turned slowly, its red band pulsing at a rate someone had clearly chosen for maximum solemnity. Delegates from 41 member species applauded before the translation had even finished playing to the visiting press pool, because the vote had already been circulated as a formality 3 days earlier, and the applause had been scheduled along with the room. The Convocation's compassion, Marchetti would later note, had a run of show. It had a lighting cue. It had, tucked into the final slide of Velsorin's presentation, a projected resettlement timeline broken into 4 phases, each phase color-coded, none of which included a line for objections. The room was silent for 4 seconds. Then Dr. Elena Marchetti, solar physicist, tenure denied twice, currently employed by a university that had stopped returning her equipment requests, stood up without being recognized and said the only sentence anyone remembered afterward. "Your model is wrong and I can show you where." Marchetti had spent 11 years arguing that Sol's magnetic braiding pattern behaved differently than the standard convective models predicted, a position that had gotten her removed from 2 international panels, and one very public letter signed by 40 of her peers explaining patiently that she had misunderstood her own data. She had not misunderstood her own data. She sat down that night and pulled the Convocation's own advisory dataset because she wanted to know exactly which numbers a species with 5 centuries of stellar cartography had gotten wrong. She had been right before, quietly twice. Once about a coronal mass ejection 3 universities said would miss Earth entirely and did not. And once about a satellite anomaly everyone blamed on a manufacturing defect, until she traced it to a magnetic field variation no one else had bothered to log. Neither correction had earned her an apology. Both had earned her a reputation for being difficult in meetings. Velsorin granted her a hearing largely because refusing one would have looked worse on the recordings his own government would review. "You have 6 hours with our raw telemetry," he said, still smiling. "I suspect you will find our models considerably more thorough than your own." He did not say it unkindly. That was, Marchetti would later admit, the worst part. Velsorin had spent 3 decades on relocation advisories before Sol 3. Each one delivered to a species too young in stellar cartography to have an opinion worth documenting. He had learned English the way a diplomat learns a courtesy language, fluently and without affection. Because a species that has bothered to master your grammar has told you, without saying so, that it does not expect you to master theirs. He was not cruel. He genuinely believed the 6 hours he offered Marchetti was generous. No one in 5 centuries of advisories had ever needed a 7th. She assembled her team from the 2 people the astrophysics establishment had spent a decade politely ignoring. Dogt Quem Osai Magnetohydrodynamics. No relation to any famous Osai, just the second most common surname in Ghana and an unhelpful coincidence at every conference badge table. Who had published a paper 4 years earlier arguing that convective overshoot near the tachocline could produce exactly the kind of braided flux ropes the Convocation's model assumed were impossible. A paper that had earned him a reputation as clever and unserious in equal measure. And Priya Ilangavan, a data engineer who had built her own solar weather forecasting tool in her spare time. The three of them opened the Convocation's telemetry in a borrowed server room in Geneva with 60 hours until the review deadline, though Velsoren had said 6. No one had slept a full night in 3 days, and no one mentioned it, because the data set in front of them was larger and cleaner than anything any of the three had ever been allowed to work with, and there is a particular kind of exhaustion that feels, for a while, indistinguishable from joy. The first thing Osai found was in the sun's tachocline layer, the thin shear boundary where differential rotation twists the magnetic field. He stopped talking mid-sentence and did not start again for almost a minute, staring at a rendering on the shared display. Their model treats the tachocline as smooth, he finally said, because their model was built for stars that don't have a rocky core history like ours. Sol's early accretion left microscopic density variations at that boundary. The variations aren't in their dataset because the variations aren't in their physics. He said this the way a man says something he has waited 11 years to be allowed to say. Osai's paper 4 years earlier had proposed almost this exact mechanism, and had been rejected by 3 journals for what one anonymous reviewer called an unnecessary complication of settled convective theory. He had kept the rejection letters. He did not mention them now. He simply pulled up the archived PDF of his own paper beside the Convocation's telemetry and let the 2 documents sit next to each other on the screen, close enough that Marchetti could see, for the first time, that they were describing the same boundary in almost the same language, 4 years and 1 species apart. The second discovery belonged to Priya Ilingovan, data engineer, self-taught forecaster, and the only person in the room who had built her tools from nothing more than public satellite feeds and a refusal to accept good enough. 2 sections deeper into the flux data, in the archived record of Sol's last major flare cycle. She went quiet first, hands still on the keyboard, before she spoke. Their prediction window is off by a factor they never checked, because they're extrapolating from flare cycles on stars that don't have a moon our size perturbing the corona's rotation. She turned the monitor toward Marchetti. This isn't a small error. This is the entire terminal instability conclusion, built on a coefficient borrowed from the wrong kind of star. For 8 years, her forecasting model had quietly outperformed 3 publicly funded programs combined, a fact she mentioned exactly once at a conference, and was told politely that hobbyist tools were not eligible for the comparison. She had stopped mentioning it after that. She did not stop building the tool. The third discovery was Marchetti's own, and it was the one that mattered most, because it explained why 511 species had voted unanimously for a wrong conclusion. Buried in the metadata of the Convocation's own advisory was a note, unremarkable to anyone who hadn't spent 11 years fighting for the right to read it carefully. The tachocline model in use had been validated against 41 stellar systems, none of which had ever produced an inhabited world, because none of which had ever needed a relocation advisory tested against a civilization that could push back. The Convocation was not lying. The Convocation had simply never once had its homework checked by the species it was grading. Marchetti sat down on the floor of the server room, not from despair, but because her legs had briefly stopped agreeing to hold the weight of 11 years all at once. She stayed there long enough that Osai crouched down beside her instead of asking her to get up. 41 systems, he said quietly, and not one of them ever had a Marchetti. She did not answer right away, because answering would have meant deciding how she felt about 11 years of being wrong about being wrong, and there was not time left in the deadline for a feeling that large. Ilingovan kept working through the silence, because someone had to, and because she had learned a long time ago that the fastest way through a large feeling was a small specific task on the other side of it. She cross-referenced the 41 validation systems against the Convocation's public archive and found what she expected to find. Not one of them had ever produced a species capable of filing a correction. The Convocation had been grading its own homework for 5 centuries because no one had ever been in the room able to raise a hand. The clock accelerated on its own. A rival power within the Convocation sphere, the Threl Compact, had filed a resource claim on Sol's outer system contingent on Earth's evacuation. And once word reached them that a human scientist had requested a hearing, the Compact moved to have the relocation timeline enforced immediately rather than debated. Velsoren's office sent a formal notice, gorgeous in its cruelty. Given procedural irregularities introduced by unauthorized dissent, the Compact requests immediate enforcement. Sol 3 will comply with evacuation staging within 72 hours, or staging will be conducted without local cooperation. A compliance fleet of 6 vessels was already inbound, their arrival timed, with what Marchetti recognized as deliberate theater, to coincide with the exact hour the Convocation's flawed model predicted the beginning of terminal flare activity. The notice included a diagram of the fleet's formation, a suppression lattice designed to hold orbital staging zones open regardless of ground cooperation, and a line translated with the same courteous precision as everything else the Convocation sent, noting that resistance during a compassionate relocation is a documented symptom of the crisis the relocation is intended to resolve. Marchetti read that line twice and did not sit down this time. Marchetti's response to the deadline was not fear, it was arithmetic. If the Convocation's model was wrong about the tachocline, then the compliance fleet's shielding, calibrated against that same model, would be wrong too, tuned to withstand a flare event that would not behave the way their instruments expected. OSI ran the numbers twice because the answer felt too convenient the first time. It was not convenient. It was simply true because the Compact had built their fleet's containment fields to a spec no one had ever independently verified. Illingovan's forecasting model gave them one number that mattered more than any other. A 71% probability that the real flux event, the one the Convocation's telemetry had never seen coming, would arrive inside the same window as the enforced staging deadline. 71% was not certainty. It was, Marchetti decided, exactly the kind of number a species with 5 centuries of unchecked homework would never think to ask for. The compliance fleet entered high orbit at the 72-hour mark. 6 vessels, standard suppression lattice above the equator, their shielding fields visible even to ground-based instruments as a faint blue lattice against the dark. Velsoren's voice opened a channel to every government on Earth simultaneously. Staging begins in 10 minutes. Compliance is expected. Marchetti had one asset the Compact did not know she had. A predicted flux event, timed by Illingovan's forecasting model to arrive within the same 10-minute window. A real solar event the Convocation's own broken telemetry had failed to see coming at all. The Compact ships were braced for nothing. Their shielding, tuned to a model that assumed a smooth tachocline, could not compensate for the braided flux rope that Sol actually produced, because the physics that would have told them to expect it did not exist in their own instruments. The flare reached the fleet at minute 6. 2 vessels' containment fields failed within 11 seconds of each other, their shielding overloaded by a magnetic signature their sensors had no category for. A third vessel, flagship of the lattice, held its field for nearly 90 seconds. Its crew ran a textbook adaptive recalibration, a genuine and impressive feat of engineering under conditions no one had trained them for. Then its secondary containment buckled as well. The remaining 3 vessels broke formation at minute 8. Evasive withdrawal, full burn. One, smaller and slower than the rest, could not complete the maneuver in time. It drifted within range of Earth's orbital defense grid. An aging but functional network humanity had built for exactly this kind of contingency, and never expected to use against a species that had arrived promising mercy. Marchetti gave the order to let it go. "It's already disabled and it's already leaving," she said. "We don't need the wreckage, we need the recording." The full engagement lasted 9 minutes and 40 seconds start to full withdrawal with no shot fired by a single human weapon. Ground control in Geneva did not celebrate. OSI stood at the window for a long time, watching a sky that had, 10 minutes earlier, held 6 vessels prepared to remove 8 billion people from their own planet for their own good. Illingovan was already rerunning her forecasting model against the fleet's failure data because she wanted a second confirmation before she let herself believe the first one. Marchetti said nothing at all. She had spent 11 years being told her legs did not have the right to hold the weight of being correct, and now that they finally did, there did not seem to be a sentence built for it. Velsoren's official channel went silent for 11 minutes after the withdrawal. When it reopened, it was not the polished diplomatic feed. It was a personal transmission, unscheduled, sent from what the metadata identified as his private terminal. He did not smile this time. There was a pause before he spoke, long enough that Marchetti wondered if the connection had failed. "I reviewed your team's tachocline analysis 3 times, he finally said. "I assumed the first 2 reviews were error on my part. They were not." Another pause. "We built our model to protect species we did not expect to survive checking our work. I did not expect the correction to come from the species we were relocating for its own good. It was, in the truest sense of our language, an audacious thing to do, to be right about a star that everyone with more centuries than you insisted you could not possibly understand." The formal Convocation retraction followed 6 hours later, unanimous this time in the other direction. The terminal instability advisory was withdrawn, the relocation order voided, and Sol 3 granted provisional observer status in recognition of, as the language delicately put it, an independently verified stellar model exceeding current Convocation standard. The retraction did not mention Marchetti by name. It did not need to. Every member species with access to the record now had a citation trail that began with a human solar physicist and a rejected data request. Marchetti did not attend the retraction ceremony. She was already back in the Geneva server room with Osei and Illengaven, drafting a formal request for full access to the Convocation stellar archive, 4 centuries of data from systems no human telescope had ever reached. They're going to say yes, Illengaven said, because saying no now would mean admitting we were right about the sun and wrong about nothing else, and they can't prove that. Marchetti did not look up from the draft. I've been thinking about what's in that archive since the hearing started, she said. 12 years to figure out what's actually happening near Saul's poles. That's not a deadline anymore, that's just the next question. Osei pulled up a chair beside her, the same rejected paper from 4 years earlier still open in a browser tab neither of them had bothered to close. Illengaven started a new forecasting model. This one built from data no hobbyist tool had ever touched before, a dataset 5 centuries deep, and for the first time checked by someone the Convocation had never expected to check it. None of them mentioned the 6 ships, or the applause that had been scheduled before anyone asked a single human a single question. There was, Marchetti thought, a particular kind of victory that did not need to be discussed twice. It simply needed the next request to be drafted before the last one had finished being celebrated. Because a species that has just been proven right about its own star does not stop to enjoy it. It goes looking for the next thing everyone else assumed it could not possibly understand. It could not possibly understand.